Hello, I'm Ascendant Nomad. Joining me today is Chris Proctor, the weapons feature lead at Bungie, for a chat about Airborne Effectiveness, the changes coming to Airborne Effectiveness in Destiny 2, and just generally some questions pertaining to the implementation of AE and what the team have learned along the way. Chris, thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to join me to chat about this.
Yeah, hey Nomad, thanks for having me.
The specifics of the changes that have been released are really, they've got me quite excited just reading at them. It seems like we're headed towards the right track here, both in terms of unifying aerial combat under one system, but also still maintaining the sense of satisfaction that one gets from engaging aerially without feeling like you're being gratuitously punished. If you at home want to look up the changes that we're talking about, there's a link in the description below to the TWAB so you can follow along. And I do really want to dive into those changes, but because of the history that we've had with Airborne Effectiveness up until this point, I feel like it's more important to dive into the why behind it all first. The first question I have for you is, now that we've got these changes out in the wild, the most pertinent question is from pretty much everybody that I feel like I've talked to about this topic is, why did it take so long to address the feedback and sentiment regarding the system?
Yeah, we've seen this question a lot as well, so I'm happy to have a chance to speak to it. This is a pretty large new system. Like, we had engineering work, there's a ton of design work, months of playtesting. Whenever we do a large new system, it's typically a mistake to react immediately to feedback. And with something like this, we wanted to let it sit for most of a season before we even started to dig into large changes. Like, I think every single release since then we've made adjustments, but they've been typically on the smaller side. And that's because we were figuring out exactly what to do so we could make a properly informed decision. Like, as you're no doubt aware, it takes weeks for the PvP meta to even begin to settle. So trying to do anything like right after launch wouldn't have worked. We're also on the weapons team typically working 2 seasons ahead, so we're currently doing season 21 development, just to give you an idea of.
So even if you wanted
timelines.
to make immediate changes to the season, you weren't able to because you were already locked to a development cycle 2 seasons ahead. Is that correct?
Right. Yeah. Exactly. And it's not so much that we can't make changes, provided that we stay on, live triage's good side. We can make high priority or low risk changes. But if we want to do something that's properly playtested, we can't really do that in the middle of a season. We have to do it in the season that we're actually doing active playtesting on, so we make sure that we get enough time on it. But yeah, typically this means that we don't typically ship big changes to a season big changes to a system for 2 seasons roughly, and we do like minor changes in the meantime. So in the case of Airborne Effectiveness, we introduced it in Season 17, we made a bunch of changes, and then we started planning like larger scale changes towards the end of Season 17 in retail. We put it in the Lightfall release initially because annual releases get a ton of playtesting time. Like normally we playtest a season for like 2 to 3 months. Annual releases, we have some amount of playtesting going for probably 4 or 5 months, something like that. And then as soon as we had a change that we felt like was where we wanted it to be, we pulled that into the season or mid-season patch, which ended up being the Season 19 or 6305 balance update.
If I were a Twitter user, I would be jumping on that and saying, "Hey, did you play tested this game and you thought that the Airborne Effectiveness as it shipped felt good, but I don't want to go in there. I don't want to mention that because I know that nobody's going to get an answer that's satisfactory." So instead, let me ask you this. I understand the conservative approach to implementing a new combat system and making changes to that, because you do want to let that settle and you do want to really iron out the kinks and you want to get all the feedback that's possible. However, something that really stood out for everybody, regardless of what their feelings were in how it performed, was the lack of ability to spec into it. Like, when it launched, it didn't have steady rounds giving 7 Airborne Effectiveness or whatever that value was. You only had Icarus Grip, and we didn't have in-flight compensator. We didn't have a bunch of these mods that came out later, and the tweaks that came for Season 18, I believe, or Season 19. There continues to be that frustration. Like, did you foresee that frustration was going to be a thing for at least 2 seasons? How did that system get shipped in the first place without a developed, I suppose, ecosystem surrounding these mods?
Yeah, the frustration is understandable. Honestly, shipping the system in that way was intentional, and the reason is it's much easier and safer both for like development time and risk and sentiment to ship a system reasonably conservative and then add to it or buff it over time than it is to ship with too many options and then have to strip some of those out or nerf some of them later. Like I'm sure you can imagine if we shipped the system and by equipping a helmet mod, you could be just as effective airborne as you were before. Everyone would be thrilled, but it wouldn't have made any difference. Like, it wouldn't have achieved the goals that we were setting out to do. So we wanted to have the system in a place where we could bring it up to the point where everyone was satisfied with how it felt while still achieving the goals. If that makes sense.
So to follow up on that, since it was a global system change, it did affect every player in this game, including those in PvE. What was the rationale for allowing... Because it definitely felt like it was motivated by PvP, fundamentally, at the time. Yeah. Because at the time, you definitely weren't at liberty to say that, hey, Strand is coming, and this is why we're actually making the system. But there wasn't much thought or care given to PvE players. So what was the rationale at the time to ship it or communicate it in such a way that it would affect PvE players as well?
Yeah, so two things. Firstly, deliberately engaging while airborne is not a typical PvE behavior. Like, if you're airborne and you're playing hard content and you're inside of AI, they're just going to snipe you out of the air, typically. So it's not something we see people do a lot. Secondly, AI move in pretty predictable ways. Don't try that hard to dodge your shots. So we find that aim assist penalties aren't a huge deal in PvE. The problem that we've seen, though, and this is like a pretty fair complaint, is that if you happen to be airborne for some reason and your shot looks like it's on target and it misses, that stings in PvE as well. This is also the reason why most heavy weapons are super accurate while airborne. In any case, one reason for the changes that we're doing now is that accuracy is barely going to be penalized at all. Like, will be penalized less than it was before the introduction of AE. And that will help out PvE players a lot.
Okay. I brought up that term accuracy, and I have a lot of questions about that term. Because it has been a bit loosey-goosey in terms of what it actually means. I remember Cool Guy made a video on this, the truth behind Airborne Effectiveness, where he explained what these terms actually mean and why there's so much misunderstanding. But we'll get to that in a second. Going back to PvP, so it's fair to say that Airborne Effectiveness was a PvP-minded change, correct?
Yeah, that's fair.
Okay. As it stood and the way it was communicated, it felt like it was something to artificially compress the skill gap a little bit, because you have a bunch of low skill players going up against high skill players. Low skill players are already having a hard time dealing with high skill players being superior in gun skill, movement, game sense, all the rest of it. And then there's aerial combat on top of that. So it just felt like we're going to attack that one thing for no reason. But with skill-based matchmaking, that becomes less of an issue. Did you know about skill-based matchmaking, and did you push for it to be implemented before skill-based matchmaking?
Yeah, so we work pretty closely with any of the other teams that touch this kind of stuff. So Frameworks typically handles matchmaking and sort of PvP modes and that sort of thing. We have playtests with them, we have regular syncs, so we for sure knew that skill-based matchmaking was going to be introduced in a fairly limited form. But season 17, I think the first one was, yeah. And then, yeah. So like at that point in the game, only competitive had skill-based matchmaking, and then it was introduced to other modes over the next couple of seasons. Yeah, like and this, we speak to this a little bit in the TWAB copy, right? Like we had two reasons for setting the goals for Airborne that we did. One is, as you point out, in a world without skill-based matchmaking, the skill delta is just too high. The other reason is that as we're introducing more airborne movement options in Lightfall, we wanted to make sure that we were well set up to be able to tune the game based around those, because while Destiny lets you be airborne quite a bit, it's not fundamentally an airborne game, and we don't want it to become a game where you engage airborne first. Like, we don't want every engagement at a high level to be with both players airborne, right? Like, that's not fundamentally a goal of the game. Well, with skill-based matchmaking coming in, we're aware that we were probably going to end up tuning around this. It wasn't a done deal that it was going to roll out across all PvP modes at that point. So we wanted to be able to have the levels that we needed to tune regardless of what happened. Like, if skill-based matchmaking rolled out across the entire game, as it ended up doing, we could dial the system in for that. And if like that experiment ended up not going the way that we wanted, and skill-based matchmaking ended up leaving. We wanted to have the levers for that as well. And it was all set up for Strand and Lightfall. Of course, when we introduced this, we couldn't talk about Strand, and we couldn't talk about any plans for skill-based matchmaking rolling out wider or anything like that. So yeah, the initial communication was hurt somewhat by that, but the logic was like skills-based matchmaking, whether it was going to be in the game or not, and knowing that Strand was coming and everyone was suddenly going to be airborne a lot more.
So it felt like the right decision to make regardless of the timeline of which it was being implemented.
Yeah, I mean, so Strand ships in Lightfall, which that's season 20, right?
Yep.
That's only 9 months from season 17 to season 20. That's like, if you want to ship a system, have like one major revision to that system, that's a pretty short timeline in game development. Like, you observe it for a few months, and then you ship it after that, and then you've got one more season if you need to make any last changes, and then Strand is live. But it's important that you not introduce this gigantic new airborne set of atoms in Strand and try and ship a system that addresses those at the same time. Right. There's too many things that can go wrong.
Too many variables, I understand.
Yeah.
It's funny you say only 9 months. For us, that feels like a lifetime from a player perspective, because we don't get to see the magic behind the curtain, as it were. I just want to circle back and said that what you said about Destiny 2 not being primarily an airborne engagement kind of a game. Yeah. I do fundamentally agree with that. I think most people keep their feet on the ground. However, when sort of the strats and the playstyles started emerging, with players taking to the air and jump sniping and trick shots and that sort of thing, like it's very good for content purposes. It's also very, very fun to do from that perspective. I was wondering if you had any idea what sort of percentage of players was actively playing like that. If you have any data or any insight, like sort of the outrage we see on social media, is it overblown with respect to like how many high skill players there actually are in this game using this sort of playstyle? Or is it a very, very fundamental part of the game and you thought, well, we're going to pick the lesser of two evils as a form of decision making?
I think that airborne gunplay to a limited degree is fairly common. Like, people will, jump around a corner and like aim their shotgun downwards, or they will take the occasional jump shot with a hand cannon or a sniper rifle, even at sort of medium skill. I think that for players who frequently engage in the air, it's more in the maybe 10% of players, something like that. So, I do think it's a reasonably large percentage of high school players. But this is also part of why the way the system has gone is effectively removing what we would call accuracy penalties. And we can get a bit more into what exactly that means.
Yep.
But leaning more on what we call like aim assist and precision aim. So for skilled players who can land their shots, you're not going to be aiming at something and miss, which was, I think, a common complaint from high school players previously.
Right.
So we think we're in a space where we're able to satisfy the goals without it feeling to high school players like we're ruining their fun. That's certainly not a goal. You touched on this a little bit earlier, but with skill-based matchmaking in the game, we actively want to promote rewards for like skillful moves in the game. Like, we're fine with there being a skill gap. We're just not fine with like mixed lobbies having a large skill gap where skill delta is sort of artificially inflated because we're rewarding, we're doing a rich gets richer kind of thing.
Okay.
But in a world, skill-based matchmaking is much less of an issue.
Right. There's so much more I could go into with respect to just like that artificial skill gap, but that's a whole separate conversation, so I won't go there. But I will say we brought back Crucible Labs. We have Crucible Labs in the game again. Was there any consideration or any thought to perhaps leveraging this alternate mode, this whole other section in the directory as a sort of public test region, as a sort of public play space where we can sort of test these changes ahead of time? Is that within the purview of what you're capable of doing from a developmental side, like having a separate sandbox limited to one playlist?
For certain things, we can leverage Crucible Labs. We could say, in this mode, we apply a buff or a debuff to players, which influences all of their weapons in this very consistent way. But there are two problems with Crucible Labs. The most significant one is we can't do any nuanced kind of tuning because all you have is like some fairly broad levers for it. Like, anytime we're introducing a new stat or we're doing something where nuance in tuning is important, it means at the very least touching the tuning for every single weapon type in the game. Which is a huge amount of data. And in this case, or if it's a new stat, it means touching every single weapon in the game, and there's like 1,000 of them. And that's not something that we can turn on and off with a switch, right? The other problem is that the type of player who plays Crucible Labs is very self-selected. It's not like everyone who jumps into PvP jumps into Crucible Labs. So it wouldn't have been properly representative. So
unless you made it the main playlist and got rid of quick play, for example.
Right, yeah. If we were saying like this week, everyone has to play this way, like sort of how we do with Trials Labs. Like it not really being representative of a system that would ship meant it would have limited value for assessing whether that was really viable or not.
Would you benefit from having a broad set of data for any prospective changes?
I think we would. It's a bit pick and choose. There are certainly some things that we're talking about introducing in the future that we would want to do in Crucible Labs, like activity modifier for Nightfalls or something. Like if you want to change something fundamental about player durability or like something like that, that's something that you can do in a wide, like just with the broad set of levers like we have.
Sure. There is that common sentiment that constantly comes up. It's like, and it's not a fair comment. It's like, did you playtest this? And it's like, of course you did. Of course you did. When a system ships like that and it's so bad, those questions do come up. Did you foresee that kind of feedback? Did you have an inkling that might be how people responded?
Yeah, I mean the goals of the system are pretty clear up front, and we play tested to ensure that we were hitting those. Like as I mentioned earlier, you're better off introducing with a fairly basic set of options for build crafting and then adding to those later rather than the alternative. The other is like if the change had been too subtle, then we wouldn't have really gotten any information from it either. Like we would have substantially changed the experience. So certainly I think there are things that in hindsight we would have done differently, but I don't know that there was a way to foresee exactly how it all ended up playing out.
Okay. All right. Well, that's the implementation side of things that I wanted to cover. I want to talk about the communication around this, around Airborne Effectiveness, because there was a lot of confusion. There was a lot of, I'm not going to say misinformation. I don't think that was accurate. I think there was a lack of information in terms of just how people responded to it and how they understood the system. And the funny thing is, the really funny thing is that you explained everything. You showed us everything. But there was a lot of sort of confusion with the terminology that you were using. The TWAB of May 5th, 2022, this was the TWAB, I think 2 weeks after you actually had the TWAB, the April 21st TWAB, where you actually introduced the system as hey, this is a thing now, and this is what's going to happen. Then I don't know whether it's because you guys saw the questions or the outcry or the reaction, you felt compelled to make a follow-up. And by May 5th, there were terms like precision angle threshold, auto-aim, accuracy cone. And a lot of these terms were just sort of put in there. And there was a few explanations, like auto-aim was bullet bending and magnetism, and I think that's sort of generally understood. But then you have certain terms that have counterintuitive meanings, like accuracy cone. For example, if your accuracy cone has a higher value, your shot is more likely to miss. So if you have higher accuracy, you miss more. Once you understand what a cone is, it makes perfect sense. But the concept of cone isn't well understood by Destiny players because it's fundamentally an invisible mechanic. Yes, you can see it through hipfire and all of that, but the average player is not looking at their hipfire cone when they're shooting someone. Furthermore, we were also given only like one still image to explain a dynamic system when you had the circles and the Guardian, that image from the May 5th. The question is, and I'm sure you've had a lot of time to reflect on this, is do you feel like more could have been done to better explain these terms, especially you're referring to cones and such, which are invisible systems in this game, like we can't readily see them, in light of the fact that the community's had a genuine amount of difficulty understanding the system as it is?
Short answer, yes. There are certainly other ways that we could have presented the information. I think one lesson from those two TWABs in particular is it's sort of the opposite of what you're getting at. We put too much information in there because we wanted to be as transparent as possible about everything that the system was doing, and that's actually fine for like skilled players like yourself, or you mentioned Cool Guys videos on accuracy. Like there are people who deeply understand the game systems and will take the explanations that are super detailed, latch onto them and fully understand them, and then be able to explain those to other people. And I think in hindsight, it was actually a mistake to have like a 30-page TWAB going into a huge amount of detail that was going to be presented to the player base at large. And in retrospect, we would probably have given, this is how the changes are going to feel, and hey, here's a whole separate article. You've seen these from engineering and whatnot before, but like we could have done something like that and shipping that at the same time. I think we're probably still going to come back and do that. Here's how all of the gun systems work in Destiny. And
from a personal perspective, I absolutely love the amount of detail you put in, but I can understand that it's a long wall of text, and well, for a lot of people, even normal TWAB is a long wall of text. So you have Astacross making these TWAB videos every week, and they do extremely, extremely well. Were you hoping that the community would translate the changes? Would you go in saying, okay, here's all the info, here's too much info, now the community makes sense of it? Or do you feel like you guys did, you got your point across, and do you feel like you were relying on translation?
I think we were misled a little bit by how previous TWABs have been received. Like myself and the other web designers have been writing those kinds of TWABs since Beyond Light. And each time people have latched on to the details that we're putting in there and demand more. And so the next one, a little bit more, a little bit more.
Right.
Give us some more. Whoa, way too much. So I think we've found the limit for how much detail most players are going to understand in one pod reading. And so we're dialing back a little bit on that. And the standalone articles, I think, are a better way to do it. And we probably would have done like an explainer video or something like that, which would be a much easier way to. I
was going to say, it wasn't for me. For me, I don't think it was the amount of detail, although that definitely played a part. It was just the fact that, if you put that much detail into contextual, and everybody has the context of existing systems that we already know, fine. I think everybody would be able to grasp that better. But because this was a completely new system, and there are terms that a lot of people haven't seen before, that's where the confusion came.
Yeah.
Would you be open, if you ever had a global systems change, whether it's to do with accuracy cones or whether it's to do with precision angle thresholds or any of that sort of thing, would you be open to making short, 15-second videos to be put into the TWAB for the future instead of just here's a wall of text?
Yeah, 100%. I think most people are more visual learners anyway. Like, it's hard to translate what a 0.85 degree angle looks like in first person. So representing that in a video is way easier. We could do stuff like, you can see what our debug is. Like, you've probably seen that a couple of times where the cones are represented as circles.
Sure.
Like overlaying your reticle. We could pop out to third person and show you what the code looks like from above or something like that. The reason why we don't do that more often is there's a huge amount of production overhead. Like a Vidoc level thing is a massive undertaking. It's a very large amount of work.
It wouldn't even have to be a Vidoc. It would just be like get your favorite YouTuber and just give them access to behind the curtain and say, hey, here's the cone and here's how Destiny works, by the way.
Yeah, we're much more likely to go for something more lightweight like that, like where we just have a developer take a video and then we talk over the top of it, or we embed it in a TWAB, or we share it with content creators or whatever. Yeah,
sounds good. So videos in the TWAB would be a genuinely a good idea to help players understand. But something that might also help players understand is perhaps in a future update, being able to see the cones and seeing all of these systems in action. Is there any plans on introducing ways to help players visualize all of these respective systems in game, or are we keeping that sort of hidden and beneath the surface?
So as you sort of alluded to, the hipfire reticles do show you some aspects of what your accuracy and aim assist cones are doing. As you mentioned, like that's hipfire only, which isn't super ideal for a game where you spend a lot of your time aiming down sights. We do have some large changes coming to how reticles behave, particularly at high FOV, where you'll notice the reticle movement basically is removed completely. And that should make it easier to tell what's going on with your cones regardless of FOV. Weapon reticles are really the ideal place to do it because it's front and center, and for like in the moment assessment of like whether you need to pace your shots a bit more or whatever, like that's a good place to put it. That's going to be hipfire reticles only for the moment, but yeah, like probably season 21 or 22, you'll see those reticles get a lot more expressive and convey more information about weapon state, different variables depending on weapon type, or like exotics that do specific things where we want that information front and center. We'll see some more of that. We're also experimenting with implementing similar reticle styles for the aim down sights reticles, where typically those don't react much to your shooting at all, with the exception of hand cannons. We would like that to be more widespread so that you can tell the state of your gun a bit more just by looking at that. We have in the past talked about, well, what if we could turn on, like I give players a way to turn on debug information in the game. Problem is that it's super technical and like gets in the way of gameplay. So it's not something that we could just naively switch on across the board, even on a toggle or whatever. And it's something that's super, super niche, so it's a bit of a hard cost to justify. I'm hopeful that the extra information that we're putting in the reticles will help a lot with understanding of this system in combination with explainer videos or whatever, so we can tell you what the changes in reticles mean as far as those cone sizes go.
Yeah. Okay. Are you at liberty to say what information you're going to be putting in those reticles?
Currently, there are two things that are represented. One is accuracy, the degree to which your bullets will spread out around that center point, and auto aim or bullet bending. If a target is inside that circle or inside that cone, the bullet will correct to that target. So that's what we have currently. I think we can make those more visible regardless of FOV, because currently there are minimum, maximum sizes, like pixel sizes, that those reticles can take up on screen, because otherwise they end up getting like way too large at like low FOVs and way too small at high FOVs, so there's a clamp to it. We're going to be abstracting these specifics a little bit, because currently if you're at the exact right FOV and they're within the constraints, they will exactly represent those cone angles.
So what is the optimal FOV then?
For seeing that sort of information, it's 85.
85, okay.
And certainly, like if you run at lower FOV, you'll see a lot more of this information. But the reality is, all of these reticles were built for D1 and to some extent D2 launch. And now everyone on all like current gen platforms can change their FOV, and most people are not running at low FOV, they're running at high FOV. So there's definitely scope to re-optimize how these are built to target a higher FOV than they do currently. As far as additional information, you could think of stuff like, well, what if the fusion rifle charge meter was just in the reticle instead of like only being represented on the weapon, or like if you're listening to the audio, or stuff like shot counts for
I'm sure you could come up with hundreds of different variables that would be better represented in front of you, but I suppose I was just more concerned with the actual, like the invisible hand, almost like the invisible systems, like these cones and accuracy cones, auto aim, that sort of thing. And whilst there is representation in hipfire mode, it's it does require you to go into private matches and do trial and error testing. And then, if you follow Fallout, that's why he lost his mind a couple of years ago doing that for shotguns. And you didn't pay me to say this, but thank you so much for that.
Yeah, well, I hope with the fixed pellet spreads and the reticles that actually represent where the pellets are going to go, that his job has gotten a fair bit easier. And on the point about FOV, the shotgun reticles will properly match FOV. So like that's an example of something that we can do with reticles to make it clearer what's going on with your weapon.
Okay, so moving forward, just on that same vein, we're talking about sort of more information being shown in the game. Is there any plans to introduce a lookup table of all archetypes associated cone values and their penalties per archetype? Because right now, we kind of only know the values of snipers and hand cannons, and both of those are from the April 21st TWAB, where we're talking about how they would be affected in the air. Is there any plans to reveal that, either in a technical TWAB or perhaps even better in-game?
We haven't directly talked about a lookup table with literally every value in it, but I think any of this sort of information would go in a standalone article. Like we've been putting one together explaining all of how all of the aiming systems work. And if there's an appetite to have a bunch of information on all of the different weapon types, we could certainly have an appendix to this article which just has all of that information there.
Sure.
It's not like that's top secret or anything. We're fine with sharing it. It's just information overload if we just put it in a place where most people are going to read it.
Right. So let's talk about the changes. For primary weapons, aim assist, we've reduced all additional primary weapon auto aim, which is bullet bending, penalties by 60% at 0 AE for mouse and keyboard and controller. Increase the precision angle, how far off target you can be, and still have auto aim give you a headshot instead of a body shot, by 50% at 100 AE. Change the curve to be exponential so you get more benefit at high AE versus M. Does that mean that you're increasing the hitbox size of a crit spot? Is that what that means? If you spec into AE, you go fully up to 100, you basically have way more leeway to turn a shot into a crit.
It's that's certainly how it will feel to players in game. Like it effectively is going to feel like the head's a little bit bigger. But yeah, the way it works is if you're aimed at a target, say you're aimed at someone's neck and or their chest, right? And your aim assist cone is large enough that the head is included. But the precision aim cone is fairly small because we want you to have to actually aim to get those crits, and that's not over the head. You'll get the body shot.
Is that going to be a higher value? Is the precision angle threshold going to be a higher value in the air at 100 AE than on the ground?
No.
Okay.
No, and the precision angle cannot exceed the auto aim angle. So it maxes out at whatever the current auto aim angle is.
Right. Can you explain that layering? Like what's coming in first? Is it auto aim, precision angle, and then accuracy? Can you? I suppose let's break down the aiming system, shall we? Like, because there was like I said before, we only get that one image from the April 21st trial where we have circles over the Guardian. So
yep.
How does this work? I suppose the fundamental question. Because I have theories, but it was never really explained and laid out so clearly.
Sure. Yeah. So caveat. This is not an explainer video. I don't have a video of gameplay to show you to make this really clear, but we can certainly give it a shot. If you're aimed at a specific point, your auto aim cone will capture everything around that point.
Okay.
And if there's a target, like a target that we want to correct your aim to within that, then we'll do that. Then secondly, if your precision aim cone is above a crit spot, then we'll aim at the crit for you. Once the aim target, like the direction that you're aiming is specified based on that, then the accuracy cone determines how far away the shot will land from that.
I knew I had a feeling that was like the accuracy cone was the ultimate arbiter of like where the shot ends up, basically. So if we have layer 1, which is auto aim, which is fundamentally aim assist, right? That's what people understand as aim assist. So layer 1 is aim assist. Then you have qualifiers within that layer where basically you have a precision aim assist angle, where basically if you have a certain amount of leeway of where your reticle is and where the target is, if there's an overlap between two invisible circles where it's your reticle and the precision target, then it will assign you that headshot, correct?
Right.
And then the third layer is accuracy or error angle, as it's sometimes referred to, where it will do a calculation based on the size of that invisible cone as to where the final target ends up. Does the precision angle threshold, the precision angle override the accuracy cone, or is it taking everything into account?
So all of the auto aim stuff just determines the specific thing that that the game thinks you're aimed at.
Right.
And then accuracy applies after that.
Okay. So the game might think the game might assign you a headshot, but could the accuracy cone then take that away from you?
Yes. Yeah. Say for example, you're spraying an SMG and your accuracy cone is getting kicked way out, like you see your crosshairs expanding, so you know your shots are no longer accurate. It doesn't matter at that point if like the center of your reticle is directly over someone's head. If your reticle is bloomed way out, that shot could go around their head.
Right.
That's how that system works.
Right. Because that makes sense. But then I suppose if you're dealing with, let's put in the hyper specific scenario, which people will absolutely want to know. Jumping in the air with, let's say for argument's sake, a Hawkmoon, the best hand cannon in the game. Let's say you're jumping in the air with Hawkmoon, and the game's giving you a headshot. The game is giving you, like, your aim assist cone is within the target. It's well within the precision angle target. Is there any way, because Hawkmoon doesn't get Icarus grip, is there any way that the game will say, no, actually, that's not a headshot in this new system?
In the new system, like, the baseline accuracy of weapons is the same as slotting an Icarus grip before AE. So the Hawkmoon example is interesting because exotics can't slot mods, right? So a pre-season 17 Hawkmoon would pretty frequently miss that shot.
Yeah.
Next week, Hawkmoon will hit that shot if you're inside typical hand cannon ranges.
Okay. And with opening shot, we've, like, in my private testing, I found opening shot was the number one perk to mitigate any sort of accuracy penalties. I suppose that's now just like a guaranteed, like, that's probably going to be your number one pick for any sort of single shot weapon for the air.
Yeah. Yeah,
Okay.
absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, the opening shot benefits for accuracy cone apply on top of whatever your stats for airborne.
Understood. All right, so let's continue with the changes. We removed all additional primary weapon magnetism, which is reticle friction, penalties, and at 60 to 100 AE, you get a magnetism bonus compared to pre-AE, only on controller. I do remember that when you went in the air, you had Icarus grip, you got a little bit of stickiness. You didn't get a whole much, but basically it was enough to, like, lock onto the target and your aim would move towards that target.
Yep.
If there are no penalties being applied to begin with, then what does this look like?
It's firstly important to note that Destiny has always had reduced auto-aim, reduced magnetism while airborne. Like the cones by default are just reduced. That's why your reticles always changed when you jump, right? If you're playing at an FOV that allows your reticle to move.
Sure.
Pre-AE, you now have no magnetism penalties for primary weapons at all.
Right.
And then if you build into AE, you'll actually get more stickiness while airborne than you ever could have before.
Will it ever be comparable to that of the stickiness you get when you're grounded?
On certain weapons, if they have a large enough magnetism cone to begin with, you could approach grounded. Yeah, but you'll have to. It would be a very specific situation, and it's never going to quite get there. I don't think. Like you'll always have slightly lower while airborne.
See, this is where the lookup table will be handy, right? So we could look that up and see which is going to be the meta. Like the scenes, I can already imagine. Turns out Whistler's Whim has perfect magnetism in the air, the worst PvP bow archetype, right? Anyways, moving on before we go completely off the rails. Reduced accuracy penalty for all primary weapon types. Per weapon type, hand cannons and sidearms get 60% less penalty to accuracy. Auto rifle, scout rifle, pulse rifle, submachine gun get 20% less accuracy penalty, and bows get 30% less. For most of us that play the game, I think we can understand intuitively the sort of changes you're making on a per archetype basis. But could you explain those who aren't to those who aren't as familiar with weapon feel and sort of just general weapon size as to why you've opted to reduce hand cannon and sidearms by so much compared to the rest?
Firstly, we decided to just target pre-AE Icarus grip, because that's something that all established players they understand what that means. Like, you know what an IS Lunar with Icarus grip felt like before AE came in, and so we want your baseline experience to feel like that. And then, of course, if you slot Icarus grip on top of that, it'll be even more accurate, like tighter accuracy cone than it was before. So that's why they're all different, because pre-AE Icarus was not the same for hand cannons as it was for submachine guns, etc. Because the AE stuff was tuned separately per archetype, not necessarily having that as a reference point. So effectively, submachine guns didn't have as far to go because they were already a little more forgiving while airborne.
Okay.
As far as why they were tuned this way, chunk damage weapons are way stronger at jump shooting, so we're a little cautious with those up front with AE.
Understood. So the jump shot weapons were already hit pretty hard. Essentially, was that what that comes down to? Yeah.
And so they because we then leveled everything out to Icarus grip. Yeah, hand cannons got brought down a lot more to hit that bar.
Okay. The final set of changes I have in front of me is snipers, rifles, and slug shotguns have reduced their airborne accuracy penalty by 50%, and pellet shotguns have had their penalty completely removed. Is that because of fixed spread, I suppose, right?
It's because if you're jumping with a shotgun and you have this reticle, super cool reticle that shows you exactly where the pellets are going to go, and then they go somewhere slightly different, that feels super bad.
Right.
So that's why we removed it, but also spread angle still changes a little bit while airborne, and we think that is a more appropriate lever to use to balance pellet shotguns than accuracy is.
Okay.
Particularly since as of Lightfall, when you jump, we will actually show you the real spread angle at that point, so it'll be easier to tell what's happening.
Okay, fair enough. Vex Mythoclast.
Mm-hmm.
Ooh, that's a nice little chime. Vex Mythoclast basically reads as a 360 auto rifle, correct?
Yep.
Okay, so it's getting that 20% reduction in airborne penalties. How does the linear fusion mode get affected by this? Is it get treated like a primary? Does it get treated like a special weapon? Is it subject to these reduction in aim assist penalties? And also, by the same token, Revision 0 with its alt-fire sniper mode. Also, again, like any other future exotics that you might have planned, which have a toggle mode that turns it into a special weapon archetype. Are those getting hit as well? Are they being tuned independently? How are you dealing with those sort of situations?
So how I answer this depends a bit on how much you want to be held responsible for single-handedly changing the meta. So the way that primary ammo exotics with alternate fire modes work is they take all of this data from their base weapon type. So Vex Mythoclast has all of the like airborne stats of this 360 auto rifle. Revision 0 acts like a pulse rifle for all of this sort of stuff. So their alternate fire modes are not penalized as though they were special weapons.
Okay. So
yeah, they're both very strong while airborne, in summary.
Yeah, I was going to say, if you've got the pulse rifles, especially aggressive 4-burst pulse rifles, have rather good airborne effectiveness, which is hilarious because you just stay at the back and lane with them on the ground. So it could very well be that these are the most effective snipers in the game. Very cool. Very cool. I'm sure people love to hear that. Cool.
I do think if you're trying to do jump shots with a charge weapon, that's pretty tricky.
Yeah.
Like if you can pull off a headshot without heat rises active with Mythical Ast's LFR mode, more power to you.
Gotcha. Switching gears just a little bit. On July 28th, the TWAB introduced this internal metric of skill for the use of skill-based matchmaking algorithms. There's the TWAB specifically explaining how we're going to be implementing skill-based matchmaking. There was an image inside this TWAB where basically it showed every player residing in the skill range between negative 1,000 and positive 1,000, with the mean range sort of being around that 0 to 200 mark. In your opinion, or maybe you have the data to actually give a concrete answer here, what skill banded player you expect will notice these changes the most, and what band will make the most out of aerial combat?
So we touched on this a little bit earlier. I think that, and we mentioned that a lot of players will take jump shots from time to time.
Sure.
And I think everyone will notice that those are a lot more accurate than they were before. So if you're aimed at a thing with a primary weapon, typically you'll hit it. We've seen that players at a higher skill level play airborne a lot more often, so those are the types of players who will notice the largest improvement, particularly without investing. Like if we've got a super skilled player, like top 10% or something, who is able to accurately aim while airborne, they will land a lot more shots now, and they'll see a lot of benefit. They won't feel necessarily like they have to put anything into AE to get to that point.
Right.
But players who aren't quite as confident in their airborne shots will definitely see some benefit from, slotting Icarus or wearing an exotic that buffs it or something.
Okay, so you feel like it's a global change, like everybody's going to be able to make use of it, everybody will notice this.
Yeah, and I think your example about PvE is also relevant here, right? Like PvE players aren't going to deliberately build for airborne gunplay.
No, why would they, right?
So if they are like jumping and trying to headshot Atheon or something, and the shot misses, that feels pretty bad. And they will, without investment, also see that their shots are now landing more reliably.
Understood. Okay. Now, that, all of this sounds pretty good. All of it seems like we're going towards, like I said at the beginning, we're on the track to something that not only unifies the entire aerial system, but also feels like, it feels good to spec into, it feels good to use, it should be okay, in theory, right? Obviously, we need to see how it plays in the real world. And it's that real world that I'm very concerned about, because if there needs to be further revisions to the system, if you need to choose to tune it up or bring it down or whatever you need to do, will the weapons and the sandbox teams be able to differentiate what is a clear result of something being a statistical outlier due to its power due to its own power versus what the player environment actually encourages? Like, for an example, you may have seen the last week that Bubble Titan usage was spiked really, really high because of Ironbound and Fortress, right? Or generally speaking, your pulse rifle usage chart is way, way up this season because of the ability spam. Will you be able to make that differentiation and balance accordingly versus just like saying, hey, look at this data point, we need to bring that down? There's
a lot that factors into this and how we interpret what's happening in the live game. We, of course, pay a lot of attention to player sentiment on Reddit. We can look at how effective weapons are through in-game analytics or whatever. Most sandbox designers also play the game a huge amount. So tend to look at what they're seeing in game and be able to interpret that. We also work very closely together. Sandbox designers have something like 10 hours of shared playtests a week, where we're all looking at the same content, and we can see how weapons and abilities are working together. Typically, we're able to identify what's actually happening. We think it's, of course, it's not an exact science. We might tune the thing that isn't actually responsible occasionally. But I think in these sorts of cases we're likely to be able to identify the actual culprit and touch that one thing.
I suppose this is more of a general question, but how much does player sentiment and feedback affect your own understanding of the issues?
A huge amount. I mean, this is we're all, I am not visible on Twitter or Reddit, but
Good for
I
you.
sure read a lot of it, right?
Good for you. Stay invisible. It's not fun.
But yeah, like we are extremely up to date on where player sentiment is around like the current state of the sandbox at all times. And of course, we have community managers who are like keeping an eye out for trends and that sort of thing, which like they're diligent about bringing to our attention as well. So typically, we'll look at sentiment and see what game data needs investigation or what we need to try and playtest ourselves locally to try and figure out what's going on.
Okay. So my final question for you is admittedly a bit loaded. And I wanted to save this for the end because I feel like, not that I'm calling myself like part of this band of players specifically, but I feel like it would be a wasted opportunity to not ask this question. So I'm going to read this verbatim for as I've written down, as because I will mess this up. So bear with me.
Sure.
Various high-skill players in the community, they do feel let down, as many pointed out issues with the Airborne Effectiveness system prior to its implementation, only to find such issues coming to pass once the change went live. They saw the issues before they actually became reality. Are you, and whoever else, whatever team is relevant, are you open to working more closely with members of the PvP community as an additional avenue of validating potential changes before introducing them into the live game?
So we do have regular community summits where we talk to content creators or like occasionally just general players. We pull them in, we preview the changes. Sometimes there are playtests as part of this, but more frequently we just talk through everything because we tend to have a lot to cover. These aren't just for weapons or Sandbox, it's for all teams across the entire game. So we get to preview these changes well in advance of the shipping, and we do often make tuning changes based on opinions of people in these summits, or we use that feedback to inform how we explain the changes, because if we can't explain it in a way that makes sense to a group of players who are deeply invested in the game, we clearly need to spend a bit more time wordsmithing it. Problem is that it's actually very hard to predict how a system is going to feel from a written description. So like this sort of community involvement, which we are already doing to a degree, and like sure we could push somewhat harder on that, but it's not a silver bullet. It's not going to automatically solve all of our problems. For example, you remember the Season 13 changes that we made to recoil, like weapon recoil,
Yes.
and mouse and keyboard?
Yes.
And like we explained exactly what those changes were, and the reaction to the changes was just not at all proportional to feeling the changes in the game is the only way to really understand what's going to happen. We are certainly going to be paying attention and have mitigations ready to go fairly quickly if needed. But yeah, like I don't think that pre-communication is a silver bullet, basically.
Okay.
It's something that we do and it helps us, but it's not going to fix everything.
Okay. Yeah, I suppose the only follow-up question I had to that was just like, could you speed up the response? But again, we have a few extraneous circumstances here. Like this is a new system. There are other things. There was skill-based matchmaking involved. There's a lot of levers to look at and a lot of levers to introduce. But I'm sure, like, I guess you guys all know, like 7 months without significant changes like this was a very, very long time to go without much adjustment.
Sure, yeah. And I think we are more likely to have something in the can ready to ship a bit sooner if we were to do something like this further down the line. It is very risky to sort of knee-jerk changes though, right? Like
Sure.
if it brings to mind, remember the Ruinous Effigy nerf, which was Beyond Light, I think, where its usage just spiked wildly. Like everybody was using it everywhere all the time, and so we touched it and we shouldn't have. So it's like it's much better to sit and take a measured approach, like be fairly sure that what you're seeing is real before you go and make changes. If we make changes a few weeks into the introduction of a system, that's fairly likely going to be a mistake. Like we need to wait until things settle before we start to make any large changes. Like if there's super obvious outliers, we can touch those faster, and we will.
Right. To finish off, I suppose that confirms a Ruinous Effigy buff in the making.
Yeah, Ruinous Effigy is getting subclass verbs.
That's the scoop I was looking for, not anything else. That was the real scoop. I got it. And I assume also because Revision 0 was created by Mercules, that is immune from all nerfs. So, yeah, okay, good. Thank you for confirming that.
Yep. Only buffs forever.
Yeah. Excellent. Chris, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me and to clear up some of the questions that we had. I hope that this was good for you, and I hope that everybody watching at home, this was very informative and shed some light as to the why behind everything that has transpired. Thank you so much for coming on.
Yeah, thanks very much for having me. It's always good to have the opportunity to go into these kinds of details and really have a good back and forth about questions that the community has.
Of course.